Let's start with something fundamental, something many of us overlook, not because we lack intelligence, but because we're wired, evolutionarily and socially, to seek connection, to prioritize belonging over boundaries. When a man treats you like an option, it's not just a personal slight, it's a devaluation of your psychological significance. You've been placed on the shelf, emotionally discounted, and told, either implicitly or explicitly, that you are replaceable. And the tragedy is, many people internalize that message. They begin to negotiate their value based on how someone else sees them. That's where the damage begins. Now, let's be precise here. The idea of being treated like an option is not simply about being excluded from someone's priorities. It's about a deeper psychological dynamic, being tolerated rather than treasured, held in reserve rather than held in regard. It's a form of emotional objectification. You're not seen as a full person, you're seen as utility, something to fall back on when nothing better is available. That, from a philosophical standpoint, is the opposite of love. That's not connection, that's convenience masquerading as intimacy. The antidote begins with recognition. You must recognize your worth, not in a vague self-help book way, but in a grounded, evidence-based, reality-driven manner. What do you bring to the table? Not in terms of what you offer him, but in terms of who you are intrinsically. Your capacity for loyalty, your emotional intelligence, your resilience. These are not commodities to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. They are parts of your human dignity. And if someone fails to acknowledge those things, it's not a signal for you to do more, give more, or shrink to fit their comfort level. It's a signal to withdraw your presence. From a psychological perspective, we often seek affirmation from the very sources that injure us. This is known as a repetition compulsion. We unconsciously try to resolve early wounds by recreating them, hoping for a different outcome. But here's the truth. You don't solve rejection by tolerating more of it. You solve it by walking away from the table where you were never really invited to eat. The philosopher Kierkegaard once said, "Once you label me, you negate me." And when someone labels you as an option, they are in effect negating your wholeness. Your task then is not to argue with the label. Your task is to remove yourself from the frame entirely. Let them sit with the absence. Let them feel the vacuum left by your withdrawal. Because sometimes silence is not just golden, it's corrective. It teaches people the weight of what they thought they could take lightly. Okay, so here's the truth I want to leave you with. If someone sees you as optional, it is not your job to convince them otherwise. It is your responsibility to remember that your value is not up for negotiation. Not now, not ever. Let's talk about the compulsion to explain ourselves, this urge so many people, especially women, feel when they're being undervalued. It's a psychological reflex rooted in the hope that if we can just explain clearly enough, the other person will finally see our worth, finally treat us properly, finally respond with consistency. But that hope is often misplaced. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. People who value you don't need explanations. And people who don't, they weaponize your words, twist your vulnerability into ammunition, and still remain unchanged. When you're with someone who consistently treats you like an option and you find yourself trying to justify your feelings, trying to earn clarity or commitment through elaborate reasoning or emotional transparency, what you're really doing is negotiating for basic respect. And that's a negotiation you should never enter in the first place. Respect is not a reward. It's a baseline requirement for any real relationship. Once you start auditioning for it, you've already lost your footing. Philosophically, we can look at this dynamic through the lens of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to recognize value? Yours? No. Your responsibility is to embody value, not to advertise it. It's not your role to fill in someone else's emotional deficits or to compensate for their lack of vision, maturity, or empathy. And this is where it gets important. When someone treats you poorly, when they're inconsistent, hot and cold, dismissive, emotionally unavailable, what they're showing you is the limit of their capacity. That's not a riddle to solve. That's a boundary to respect. The tendency to explain ourselves endlessly in these situations is often a response to what psychologists call ambiguous loss, a type of emotional confusion where you're grieving something that was never clearly defined or fully present. You don't have closure because there was never real clarity to begin with, and so you try to resolve that ambiguity with explanations. But explanations don't resolve neglect. They don't fix emotional absence. They don't make someone see you if they were never looking in the first place. There's also a deeper element at play, your dignity. Every time you over-explain, you erode a little of it, because what you're really saying is, please, let me show you why I'm worthy of basic decency. That's not power, that's pleading. And pleading is a position of subordination, not equality. If you have to convince someone to treat you well, you've already made them the judge of your worth. And that's a role they should never hold. Instead, here's what strength looks like: stating your needs once, clearly and calmly, and if those needs are dismissed, minimized, or ignored, you don't raise your voice, you raise your standards. You don't beg, you back away. You don't argue, you exit. Because people hear you more clearly when your absence speaks than when your explanations scream. So remember this: you don't owe anyone a thesis paper on why you deserve to be treated like a priority. You only owe yourself the courage to stop explaining and start acting. There's a moment in every unhealthy dynamic where you have to make a choice, not a loud dramatic one, but a deliberate internal shift. You stop feeding the pattern. You stop responding to late night texts. You stop engaging in circular conversations. You stop offering emotional labor that's neither reciprocated nor respected. That's what it means to cut off the supply. And make no mistake, it's not about being passive aggressive. It's not about revenge. It's about reclaiming your psychological sovereignty. The human psyche operates on feedback loops. When you offer affection, energy, attention, and receive breadcrumbs in return, you're operating in a distorted loop, one that gradually rewires your self-worth. You become conditioned to accept less, to wait longer, to hope harder. That's not love. That's intermittent reinforcement. The same behavioral pattern used in slot machines to keep people pulling the lever long after logic tells them to walk away. So when you cut off the supply, you're not being cruel, you're refusing to participate in a psychological trap. There's also a crucial distinction here between reaction and response. Reaction is impulsive. It's the late night call, the angry text, the emotional plea. Response is measured. It's when you look at the situation, strip it of fantasy and potential, and acknowledge the truth of what's been shown, not what's been promised. Cutting off the supply is a response to reality. It's the decision to preserve your inner resources rather than bleed out for someone who only shows up when it's convenient for them. Philosophically, this taps into a principle echoed across many traditions, the concept of boundaries as self-respect in action. In Stoicism, for instance, we're taught to control what we can and release what we can't. You can't control how someone feels about you. You can't force recognition, commitment, or growth, but you can control access. You can control where your energy flows. And when you do that consciously, you realign with your own values, your own vision for a life that isn't built on waiting for crumbs to turn into meals. It's important to note that silence and distance aren't forms of manipulation when they're grounded in clarity and self-respect. They're acts of correction. They reset the power dynamic, not to gain leverage, but to remove yourself from systems that rely on your continued participation to stay alive. In other words, if you stop dancing, the dance ends. That's not cruelty, that's liberation. And yes, he will feel it. Maybe not immediately, but he will. Because absence, when it's deliberate, when it's clean, is more powerful than any argument you could have made. It forces reflection. It disrupts the cycle. It creates a space where your value is no longer deluded by your over-availability. So let me leave you with this. The moment you stop showing up for someone who only shows up when it suits them is the moment they learn the cost of your presence. Don't underestimate the power of your silence. Sometimes your absence is the loudest truth they'll ever hear. There comes a point, usually after the silence, after the withdrawal, after the realization that no explanation will ever be enough, when the question becomes, now what? What do you do with the pain, the betrayal, the confusion, the slow erosion of self-worth that came from being treated as expendable? It doesn't just disappear because you walked away. It lingers. It echoes. And here's where most people get stuck. They either suppress it or try to numb it. But that pain, if you let it, can be alchemized into something far more valuable than the relationship you lost: growth. Pain, philosophically speaking, is a signal. It tells you something's off. And in the psychological realm, it's also a mirror. It reflects where your wounds are, where your expectations were misplaced, and crucially, where you were not fully aligned with your own standards. Pain demands attention, but instead of resenting it, we need to study it, because within pain is the data for transformation. You learn who you became when you were undervalued. You see clearly the compromises you made, the silences you tolerated, the intuition you ignored. And that clarity, if you're willing to face it, is what creates change. You see, healing is not simply about returning to some previous version of yourself. That version, if we're honest, allowed the dynamic to happen. That version made excuses, kept showing up, kept hoping. So the goal isn't to go back, it's to evolve forward, to become someone who no longer entertains what they once settled for. That's what real healing looks like. It's not soft. It's not passive. It's confrontational. It's not what you confront yourself. You confront the false narratives that kept you chasing, performing, justifying, and you replace them with principles. This is where discipline enters the conversation. Not emotional suppression, discipline. The daily act of choosing what aligns with your new values, even when your emotions tempt you to go back. Because healing isn't linear. There will be moments where nostalgia disguises itself as love, where loneliness tries to convince you that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't that bad. But this is precisely where your inner structure matters. Have you rebuilt yourself with something stronger than sentimentality? Are you choosing growth, or are you just avoiding discomfort? Carl Jung said, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The process of rebuilding after emotional abandonment is not about surface level self-care. It's about confronting the hell you went through, understanding it, integrating it, and using it to build a version of yourself who is no longer vulnerable to the same kind of treatment. You rise not in spite of the pain, but because you allowed it to teach you. And that's the message. Do not waste your suffering. Don't let that pain go unexamined. Use it. Let it fuel a reconstruction so solid, so aligned with your deeper self that you become unrecognizable. Not to hurt the person who failed to see your worth, but to honor the person you almost forgot you were. The pain was real, but it was also the beginning. Use it and become better than who you were when they thought you'd always be there. At a certain point in your healing, something interesting happens. You begin to glow differently, not because you're trying to prove anything, but because you've stopped leaking energy into dead ends. You're not texting back to seek validation. You're not obsessively analyzing mixed signals. You're simply living. You're aligned with your values, focused on your growth, and without even trying, he notices. Suddenly, the person who treated you like a placeholder begins to see what he never valued when it was right in front of him. And this is where many people feel conflicted. Because there's a temptation to answer the message, to entertain the apology, to give him just enough access to see what he missed. It feels like justice. It feels like power. But let me be clear. Letting him watch doesn't mean letting him back in. Those are two entirely different things. One is rooted in dignity. The other is rooted in ego. From a psychological standpoint, what you're experiencing is a shift in power dynamics. Early in the relationship, he had the upper hand because you were seeking something he was withholding: attention, consistency, commitment. Now, the roles are reversed. He's chasing an image of you that no longer exists. He's nostalgic for the version of you that tolerated less than she deserved. And the irony is that by the time he recognizes your worth, you've outgrown the need for his recognition. Philosophically, this is a form of poetic justice, but not in the vengeful sense. In fact, it's not about him at all. It's about you becoming someone whose standards no longer make room for people who only show up once you've walked away. It's about not mistaking regret for change. Just because someone feels your absence doesn't mean they've evolved in any meaningful way. Often, they're not sorry for how they treated you. They're sorry they no longer have access to what they once took for granted. So let him watch if he chooses to. Let him sit in the discomfort of what he lost. But you keep walking, keep building, Keep becoming, because closure isn't something he gives you with words, it's something you give yourself through action. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to not go back, not even to prove that you've moved on. There's a profound psychological shift that takes place when you stop waiting to be chosen and start realizing that you are the one doing the choosing. This isn't just a matter of ego, it's a reordering of your internal hierarchy. When you've been treated like an option, your sense of agency gets distorted. You become reactive, constantly measuring your worth through someone else's inconsistent attention. But once you reclaim that agency, once you understand that access to you is not automatic but earned, the entire dynamic changes. Now, let's be intellectually honest. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It requires introspection, boundaries, and most of all, a willingness to break your own patterns. Because many people, even after walking away from the wrong relationship, unconsciously carry forward the same pattern, seeking approval, minimizing themselves, offering emotional labor without reciprocity. It's not about who you left, it's about who you are when you enter something new. There's currently saying, and that's the real battleground. Psychologically, we're drawn to the familiar, even when it hurts us. We confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety. But once you begin operating from a place of grounded self-worth, your filters change. You're no longer attracted to chaos because chaos no longer matches your internal state. You're not looking to be rescued or validated. You're looking to be met. And that's the sign that healing has taken root. You're selective not because you're bitter, but because you've become precise about what peace costs. And you're no longer willing to pay that price for temporary attention. Philosophically, this is about the evolution of identity. You're not just someone who deserves better. You're someone who embodies better. There's a huge difference. One is passive. It waits for goodness to arrive. The other is active. It attracts goodness by refusing to compromise. You set the standard and then you become the standard. That means you don't entertain people who are half in, half out. You don't chase after inconsistency and call it chemistry. You don't mistake confusion for depth. When a man treated you like an option, it was never really about you. It was about his limited capacity to see value. But now the question is, do you have the capacity to uphold it? Because every time you accept less, you reaffirm the old pattern. And every time you walk away from what doesn't align, you reinforce the new one. This isn't about punishment. It's about protection, not from others, but from the parts of yourself that used to settle. So now the roles are reversed. You're not waiting. You're evaluating. You're not hoping to be seen. You are seeing clearly. And the irony, the more selective you become, the more magnetic you are. Not because you're trying, but because people can feel the difference between someone who needs validation and someone who knows they bring value. Here's the closing truth. You were once the option. Now you are the standard. Honor that. And let every choice you make from this point forward reflect the version of you who will never forget it.